It's my pleasure to welcome you all back, and I want to add my thank you to, I believe it was Guilherme in the panel before, who thanked you all for hanging in with us. What's been a very interesting, albeit a bit of a long day, but I know that you are all looking forward to this presentation. As you know, Justice Barroso this morning promised to challenge us, to talk to us about the way ahead, to help Brazil right itself and take over again the place that it should take in South America. So we are all looking forward to hearing from Justice Barroso and figuring out our roles in pushing Brazil along. So Justice Barroso, thank you so much for joining us again.
Thank you, Sylvia. First of all, I want to thank you all from the bottom of my heart for staying until this time on a Friday. What I can promise in return is that I'll try to be as brief as I can. And although this new topic, an agenda towards the future, if we do want to discuss this, it might take like maybe 3 or 4 hours, and it would be a problem. So I'll be very objective and brief and just try to select a few issues that I think we should still discuss. I remember, Bernardo, when I have to talk about complex issues in a short period of time, I remember that reminds me of the guy that was hired to make an adaptation of War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy to a television series of 5 chapters. And he said, it's hard to translate this, he said, I can do it, but I'll have to rename it to Skirmish and Truce. Okay, so I tried to select a few topics to further discussion on an agenda for Brazil. The first one I think would be important to raise here is we still need in Brazil to overcome the prejudice and the mistrust that we have regarding private business, private enterprise, free initiative. This is still a very strong mark of Brazil's formation. We have a culture that has become, or maybe it has always been, extremely dependent on the state. We are addicted to the state in Brazil. And history has showed that at least at this stage of the human condition, private enterprise, it's a better way to generate wealth. It's not a matter of ideological choice. It's a matter of fact. History has proved it to be this way. But the mistrust that exists in Brazil regarding private enterprise has to do, I think, with the way that capitalism was introduced and developed in Brazil, with a very strong presence of the state as an alternative to conveying strategic areas to foreign capital. So since the 1940s, we have developed this sort of capitalism with a very strong presence of the state and with state-owned companies, starting with the CSN, National Steel Company, and going all the way to Embraer, the Brazilian aircraft manufacturer. But this list would include Vale do Rio Doce, a mining company, would include Petrobras, the oil company. So this state-run capitalism, I think we can say, along with paternalism and the discretionary distribution of benefits, fostered this prejudice and this mistrust that I'm talking about. So society in Brazil, many people in Brazil, maybe most people in Brazil, still associate domestic capitalism with concessions based on favoritism, on public works with dubious procurement procedures, financial fraud, and I couldn't find a word for latifundios, large, fruitless handholdings. And on the other hand, an important number of Brazilian big companies are, as I mentioned before, addicted to the state and averse to risk and competition. So we have a sort of capitalism in Brazil without risk or competition. It's capitalism with public money, public funding of everything, meaning with no risk, and this market reserve or protectionism. Well, capitalism without risk and without competition, capitalism with public money and protectionism, that's socialism for the rich, which is basically what part of the private business in Brazil have been. And to make things worse, the car wash operation has unveiled the fact that people were right. In many cases, the recent investigations uncovered that we had cartelized bids, public funding to companies based on opaque criteria, the famous desonerações, very arbitrary, and provisional measures, medidas provisórias, by which major companies would just buy, paying cash, illegitimate benefits. So we need to overcome the prejudice and the mistrust, but we need to have real, true capitalism with risk, competition, and decent business people, and I think that will help generate a good business environment in Brazil. So this is the first item I would include in my agenda. We need to, evaluate private business and try to install in Brazil a real capitalism with risk and competition. So I think this is an important item of this agenda because I think a progressive liberal project for Brazil should include democracy, free enterprise, and social justice. I think this is the tripod we should be considering here. A second item for this agenda, to some extent connected to this first one, is the resizing of the state in Brazil. The state has become larger than the Brazilian society can sustain, larger than the Brazilian society can support. To give you an idea, as we talk today, the costs of the state in Brazil are the following. About 4% of the GDP is spent on the civil service payroll, 4%. And we need to add here the cost of infrastructure, what we call custeio, meaning you need to have the streets cleaned, you need to keep the prison system, you need to keep the hospitals, and you need to keep the police equipped. So once you add up what we pay with the public servants and the minimum cost of infrastructure, there's no money left for investment. So we also have a problem involving the size of the state. The problem is so bad that most states in Brazil, most of them, cannot even pay the salary of the civil servants at this moment. To show that the model is bankrupted, states are borrowing money to pay salaries, which is something unthinkable. Not to say that the state is not paying for these service providers and to, supplier companies or everything. So the second item of an agenda will have to be downsizing the state in Brazil. And this is very difficult because we have a culture that's very dependent on the state. And this is bad. I recently met a young boy that went to one of the finest engineering schools in Brazil, a brilliant young man. And I asked him what were his plans for the future. And he said, I want to apply for a public contest and become a public employee somewhere. Somewhere. So he wasn't thinking of innovating. He wasn't thinking of using his brilliant intelligence to do something new. He wanted a job where he could accommodate and have what he regards as a safe future. So this is a terrible mentality that has contaminated even the brilliant young minds of the country. So we need to assess this problem, acknowledge the problem, and try to fight it. There is still in Brazil a falsely progressive belief that the presence of the state means protection for the poor and social justice. Well, I'm sorry to say, this is a very mistaken view. The state in Brazil has been appropriated from the beginning by big business, by politicians, by corporations, public organs that think the state should increase their benefits even in times of crisis. So, and this is an ideological problem, and it's almost a generational problem, because many people of my generation thought that the state would be the protagonist of social justice, of emancipation of people. And so they have this fiction of a generous state. Well, again, this state is not generous. This state serves the rich. This state serves people who are better off. Still these days, this week, I read on the paper that an important political leader said that he would finally support the government because people he wanted to appoint to some important public positions were finally appointed. So they didn't learn anything from Lava Jato. And today I even made a picture. It was on the first page of WOW, an important online news portal. Good, thanks. It says, I'll read in Portuguese and then I'll translate. Temer entrega Funasa ao PTN para pagar voto contra Dilma. That's the headline. Temer gives an important health agency to a incredibly little unknown political party to pay. It's quoted. Pay vote against Dilma. So it's patrimonialism in the highest degree. So I pay private favors with public jobs, with public money. So that's the culture we cannot get rid of. And we know what these people do when they get these jobs. As Petrobras shows, I mean, if we could have a contest and have people and make this question, why, what do you think that politicians and political parties want when they appoint directors to state-owned companies? Please send letters to Petrobras, Eletrobras, Caixa Econômica Federal. And so we haven't learned yet. It's very sad to say, but it was in the paper today. This use of the public space, not to do good, but to benefit parties and politicians. It's almost incredible, but it was there. Another item of an agenda for Brazil would be, we have indispensable reforms we need to make. And I sorted out 3 of them that I think are the only ways we can actually fight fiscal debt, concentration of wealth, and unemployment. So 3 of these reforms include Social Security, include the tax system, and include labor law or labor rights. So I'd like to talk briefly about this, and if we do have time, I'll go back to that political reform I couldn't finish this morning, or not. The first one is the Social Security reform, and I think the Fernando Henrique government, the Lula government, and now Michel Temer government are putting a lot of energy to make the changes that the Social Security system deserves. And of course, if we were criticizing bad things, we should also highlight the good things. And even against public opinion, these leaders, and I think the current president is putting a lot of effort in a reform that it's just indispensable. It's not ideological, it's not philosophical, it's math. It needs to be done because there's no other alternative way to deal with this problem. The numbers are astonishing in the Social Security system, which comprises both the private sector, what we call INSS, and the public sector, we call it the proper regime, INSS e regime próprio. So they both together disappeared. Okay. They both together adding up private and public sector, that takes 54% of the budget, of the national budget. 54% of the national budget in Brazil is spent paying pensions and retirement. So the country spends more than half of what it takes in with people that doesn't work, with people that don't work. And 54% is more than twice what the government spends with health, education, and all the social programs, including Bolsa Família and Minha Casa Minha Vida. So including assistance to the poor and lodging for the poor also. So if we do not enact a social security reform, we are going to leave to our kids and our grandchildren a devastated country. So it's not a matter of choice. It's a matter of not having a choice. So it's hard to believe that it's so difficult to make this go through Congress. Basic changes, like a minimum age of 65 years, which is practiced all over the world, 65 or over, and a cap on the pensions and retirements in the public sector. It needs to have a cap equal to what's paid in the private sector. If you want more, you have your private retirement plan, as in most parts of the world. So there's no survival for Brazil without a Social Security reform. The second reform, I think it's indispensable. It's even harder. It's the tax reform. Why is the tax reform so difficult? Because it's a game in which there will be winners and losers. And of course, this makes things more difficult. There are states that win and states that lose with a fair tax reform. There are individuals that will pay less, but there are others that will pay more. There are companies that will pay more. And so it's only lip service when people say, we need a tax reform, and then, but they don't really want it. Because we have this system that has two problems, I'd say: complexity and injustice. Probably no other country in the world has a tax system as complex as the Brazilian system. And so most businesses, small, medium, or large companies, need to spend a lot of time and a lot of money with tax compliance. I had a mid-size law firm, and we had an accountant, and an internal accountant, an external accountant, a law firm taking care of our taxes, and a consultant, a consultancy company. So we had like 4 levels to make sure we weren't doing anything wrong. And just like any other business in Brazil, we did have litigation with the IRS, the Brazilian IRS. So it's too complex. It needs to be simplified. But the bigger problem, I think, is the injustice of the system, because it's extremely regressive. It concentrates wealth, and that's very bad. It's not a matter of increasing taxation. That's not what I'm talking about here. But compared to most developed countries like United States, United Kingdom, Canada, and France, for example, Brazil taxes consumer goods, what we call indirect taxation, much more heavily than all these countries. But capital and even income is taxed in a much lower rate. So the indirect taxes for Brazilians, I'm talking about ICMS, which is the state tax on any sales operation. We have the service tax that's paid to the municipalities, and we have the tax on industrialized products that's paid to the to the federal government, and we still have COFINS there. I won't even dare to try to translate. So we need to change the system, because when you prioritize indirect taxation, consumers' goods, that's the taxation that myself and our housekeeper pay the same amount. when they buy any product. So that's a very unfair way of taxing because it concentrates wealth, of course. So we need a tax reform that will, I think, need to simplify the tax environment and reduce the costs with compliance. We need to unify all these consumers' goods, taxes I was talking about, and have just one. So finished ESCS, ISS, ICMS, IPI, PIS/COFINS needs to be just one. And find a way that this will be automatically distributed. But it probably would need to be federal, I think. But this could be argued. But it doesn't need to be like 4 instances of taxations on what I'm calling indirect taxation. And finally, I think that if you reduce the indirect taxations, you have to tax more capital and maybe income after a certain threshold, as most democratic countries do. We have a 35% participation of the tax system in the GDP, which is considered reasonable for the stage of development of Brazil. So I'm not really talking about raising taxes purely. I'm talking about redistributing taxes in a more fair way. And the third reform that's been discussed is the so-called labor reform. I was talking this earlier with Luis Guilherme Miliora, and this is a very interesting reality that just more recently we realized was going on, and I don't think we even have a proper diagnosis yet. But I'll share with you the data and the problem. Let me say at the outset, I am not against the labor justice or labor court, and much less I am against respecting the essential core of workers' rights. Just the opposite. If the employer is not paying to the workers what they should pay, I should, of course, defend that the employee has the right to file a lawsuit to get what is his rights. But that being said, there is something wrong in this ambit in Brazil, and probably young, brilliant minds as yours could help think what the problem is and how to face it. The problem is the following. In a recent debate with an economist that served in the Marina Silva campaign, Eduardo Gianetti, he said that a single Brazilian bank, one bank, had more labor suits, more employment suits against itself than all labor suits that have been filed in the United States. Just one bank. That's very impressive. That's amazing. That's ridiculous. I recently read an interview given by the president or the CEO of Riachuelo store. It's a chain of department stores. And he said the following: Brazil, with 2% of the world's population, brings forth more labor lawsuits than the remaining 98% of the world. That means we have more labor lawsuits in Brazil than all the world together. There's something wrong with this system. I'm not sure what's the problem. I'm not sure what the problem is. I was discussing this with Luis Guilherme sooner today, and we considered some possibilities. One that he mentioned was the complexity of the legislation. The second one, the very low cost of litigation. So you don't have to pay to go to court. And the lawyers, the 1 million lawyers that Paulo mentioned earlier today, many of them are labor lawyers. So they'll do it for free, just for contingency fees. So it's very cheap to go to court. So we have very complex legislation. It's very cheap to litigate, and there is an incredible amount of lawyers willing to do it. But there must be something else, which we need to be able to diagnose. But it can't be normal. It cannot be normal that we have more employment suits in Brazil than all the world together. So this is another point for reflection that I think we should add in an agenda for the future. I should say that the Supreme Court, in an opinion that I wrote, has started to change a little bit this mentality, establishing that especially when there are collective agreements between unions, employers and employees unions, whatever they negotiate, if it's reasonable, should prevail over a legislation that is dated 60 years, 70 years past. So this is a reform that has started through judicialization in Brazil, but I think it is a positive reform. I don't want to go much longer, but if you don't mind, I'll go back to the political reform just to say a couple words about the financing of elections, because I think this is a matter still not totally resolved, and I think it's too important to be left out of any major discussion of what's going on in Brazil. The Supreme Court struck down the legislation that provided for private companies financing the electoral system in Brazil. There was sort of a controversial decision. I voted this way, although the decision wasn't very clear in its basic grounds. It was a bit like a movie I saw by Monty Python, very old movie. It was like a race that we called it 100 meters race, and when the starting shot was given, each runner ran in one direction, so you never really know who won. So something similar to that happened here. There were three kinds of votes here. One by Justice Luis Fux, who voted saying it's unconstitutional that private companies participate funding political parties or candidates. That's one view. There was another view led by Justice Mendes e Theory Zavascki, who said the system is totally constitutional. It can stay as it is. And there was a third position that was the one I defended, that said if private companies can or cannot participate in electoral financing is a political matter. It's not for the Supreme Court to decide. But this model that we have, this is totally unconstitutional because it's against political decency and against administrative morality. Why? Because the system allows a private company to get money from the national bank for Economic and Social Development, BNDES, which is a Banco de Fomento, a development bank. And so the company could borrow money from the Brazilian people, public money, and then fund the candidate that will defend its private interests. That's outrageous. Second problem, the system permitted that the same company funded the 3 candidates that had a chance to win. So you had major companies that gave money in the last elections to the candidate Dilma, candidate Aécio, and candidate Marina. Well, if you're funding 3 opposing candidates, that's not the exercise of a political right for people who admit that a company has political rights. In this country, they think that financing campaigns is the exercise of freedom of expression. So there's craziness all over. But what I would like to say that it's totally unacceptable that you fund the 3 candidates. If you do it, you either were extorted or you were buying future favors. Any possibility, either one, is horrible. So, of course, that couldn't remain as it was. And the third problem was that the company could fund a candidate. And after he won the election, it could be hired by the new administration, with or without a bid. So the private favor, which was the donation of money, would be paid with public money. The administrative contract, as we call it. So the system was totally immoral. And I think in good time, the Supreme Court struck it down. My favorite system is a mixed system of financing. Public, as we do have, we have the party fund and we have free access to TV, and private, but for individuals and with a cap, not for companies. I wouldn't like to end without saying one word about education. I'll just stress what I think is really important in this area. We all agree, from the extreme left to the far right, we all agree that education is the way. Education is the most important thing to be done. But the point here is it's not just a matter of money, of investment. The magazine The Economist ran a story recently showing that in South Africa, they spend an incredible amount of money in the education system with very poor results, meaning that it's not only money that we're talking about. So beyond the money, I think we need short, medium, and long-term goals, and we need first-rate management. And here I want to make the point that I think is very important here. When we watched the transition from President Dilma administration to President Michel Temer administration, so after the impeachment, everyone in Brazil, the opinion shapers, all the media, everyone that was fairly well informed was concerned about who would be the Minister of Finance, who would be the President of the Central Bank, who would be the President of the National Bank for Economic and Social Development. And of course, these are important positions. And as far as I heard from my economist friends, they've made good choices. They have good people in these positions. education was part of the political division among the parties, a very partisan choice. So my proposal is education must be treated like they treat the economy, as something very important, probably the most important thing. And so the next time, I mean, it's nothing against the gentleman that is the current Minister of Education, a very kind person. It's not personal. But education must be treated like economy. Who are the best names we have? And what are the long-term projects that we want to implement? What are the successful experiences in the world? Where are the best consultancies that we can bring in and do the best job for the next 5 years, the next 20 years, and the next 50 years? Because that's how you think and plan a country for the next 50 years, for the next 2 generations, and maybe for the next century. So I have many ideas about rethinking the university, but we won't have the time. I've written on this. But in our conversation here, what I want to highlight is the need to make education more than a slogan, a real, true objective, gathering the best people we have to actually discuss what we should do in this area. There has been progress, but not enough. We need to improve this. From K-12 to the universities, we don't have any university among the 100 best universities in the world. We are one of the 10 largest economies in the world, and we don't have any university among the 100 best universities. There's something wrong with the system that we have in Brazil, and there's no real developed country without good institutions, superior educational institutions. So this is what we need to think. We copy so many bad things from the United States. We don't copy the good ones. And this is a system that has given the world many Nobel Prizes. Well, I would have many other things I'd like to discuss, even some more ludicrous things. We're talking about too many serious things. We could discuss about legalizing marijuana. I've been a supporter of this, as you probably know. The decriminalization of interruption of pregnancy in the first trimester, which is, I think it's a very important item of any progressive agenda in a country like Brazil, where you have 500,000 abortions per year, with 180,000, they call it intercurrences, actual problems that the women suffer for not being able to use the public health system to do it. But it's late in a Friday evening, and I should try to wrap up here. I was talking, Sylvia, about this marijuana and abortion, and I was giving a talk a few months ago, some time ago, and the lady, the professor that was introducing me, she said, this is, here with us is Justice Barroso. He, as a lawyer, he was the one that represented the gay cause before the Supreme Court, and as a justice, he voted for legalizing marijuana. And she says, and the next progressive item of the agenda is, I don't even know how to translate this. She said it's the poly-affective unions, which is, I am assuming, one man or one woman and several other partners in a partnership. And when she said that, it occurred to me, and I said, well, I'll think about it. But let me tell you, I am already invited to the gay parade. I am already invited to the marijuana march, which is a march for the legalization of marijuana. I am afraid of the kind of event I can be invited if I support this cause. That was funny. I need to finish. Just to let you know, in my list, but I'll have to come next year. I would include, for sure, a discussion about basic sanitation, which is the most important health preventive measure that you can adopt. We should have a chapter, very important chapter, in the preservation of the Amazon. We still treat the Amazon as a liability. It's not. It's really an asset that we have, and we ought to find a way to make it more interesting, to preserve the forest than to destroy the forest. And I think Brazil should pay for this, and maybe the world should pay for this, but we need to find a way, an intelligent way of making the world compensate the Amazon to keep it as it is, instead of having soybeans or cattle or whatever you have there. So this is an important discussion. There is an important discussion about the budget in Brazil. It's very funny. We discuss judicialization. That's probably the most important theme in the agenda in the relationship between branches. But we don't discuss the budget. How much money goes to health, education, roads, institutional publicity, and all the items you have. So we have, like in the health system, we have a major judicialization that's been a problem, if not a tragedy, in Brazil. But we discuss judicialization, but we don't discuss the budget. And if we had a more profound debate, we have 100, and we are allocating this way for these reasons. This discussion is probably much more important than judicialization, but we don't have a budget discussion in Brazil. So we don't discuss when it's elaborated, and we don't control when it's executed. So the budget in Brazil is kind of a fiction. It shouldn't be. Most democracies in the world, you spend part of one of the semesters actually discussing the budget with Congress and with society. We have this much money, for health. So let's decide what we want to do. Sanitation, fight AIDS, fight tuberculosis, or fight whatever you choose. But we have a system in which, by court orders, you have people that cost 1 million reais per year. You have to make tragic choices in life. If you pay 1 million to one person, you can be sure that other people are dying from lack of health services. That's the balancing, unfortunately. It's life against life. It's not life against budget. When I was talking about politics, I just mentioned the word real. One thing I would say, and I think it's an important metaphor, we need a real plan for the politics in Brazil. I'll say it in Portuguese. Nós precisamos de plano real para a política, meaning good ideas, good goals, and a timetable of how to do it. And we're lacking this, we're missing this, and I think we urgently need to do it. So I come to my conclusion, and I'd like to remind that Brazil only truly began in 1808 when the royal family came to Brazil, came to Rio, fleeing from in Europe at the mercy of Napoleon. Before that, before 1808, meaning 209 years ago, before that, there was no foreign trade because the ports were closed to any foreign nation but Portugal. There were no roads. It was prohibited to build roads in the colony. There were, besides not having roads, no manufacturers. Couldn't manufacture anything. We had to import from Portugal. There were no schools. And so, 200 years ago in Brazil, 98% of the population were illiterate. 1/3 of the population was made up of slaves. Moreover, we were not heirs of a cultural tradition, like the American, for example, that in 1215, a cultural tradition that in 1215 had the Magna Carta and the idea of the rule of law became to catch up. Just the opposite, Portugal was the last country. We all adore Portugal and Brazil. It's not, I'm talking about history. And Portugal was the last country in Europe to end Inquisition. The last country in Europe to phase out slave trafficking. The last country in Europe to end absolutism. So we started far behind. Far behind. And we've come a long way. We are one of the 10 largest economies in the world and one of the most important institutionalized mass democracies in the world. It's no small achievement. We were probably one of the most impressive successes of the 20th century. That's true. And we should celebrate this. I know we're not where we would like to be, but as I was saying, we've come a long way, and we are, in many senses, better off than the countries that are in the same stage of development that we are. So comparisons are important in life sometimes. Whoever travels to Rio at Santos Dumont Airport, there is a porter, and he has a sign that says, "My name is Roberto Carlos. I play better than the singer, and I sing better than the player." That means you ought to compare and see how you're doing. So if we compare Brazil with Russia, India, South Africa, China, countries that are close to us in many senses, our problems are much smaller, and easier for us to take care of. So I want to end this by saying that all my perspectives in Brazil, challenges and perspectives, is the theme of our meeting here. The challenges are big, but the perspectives are very good. And I think that very soon we are going to start resuming economic growth and many things. It's very predictable that this is going to happen because everything is waiting to be done. And so once we start doing it properly, I think we'll fare very well. My only concern at this moment is that we waste the chance of making a new country, a different country, a more ethical country, a country bigger and better. If we waste this opportunity, we will have gone through everything we've been through these past years for nothing. But if we do keep moving forward, and do the right things we need to do at this moment, I think we can accomplish a whole lot of things. And just to end this, I'd like to remember that the military regime, it seemed invincible. I can tell that's part of my life. And we couldn't figure exactly how we would overcome that. But we did. Inflation seemed invincible. And we did overcome it. Extreme poverty seemed invincible. And we also overcame that. So corruption is not invincible. Of course, you don't reduce it to zero. But we can make major improvements in this area. So what I want to say is we have fought apparently impossible battles before, and we did well. So I think we should just keep doing what we have been doing, and we'll come to a safer port. And I read recently somewhere, it was in English, a saying that I found it very interesting. It says, life is not about waiting for the storm to pass. Life is about learning to dance in the rain. I think that's a good metaphor for Brazil at this right moment. And I want to conclude with a personal motto which has inspired me in good and bad times, which is the following: no matter what's going on around you, play the best part you can. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.